Good morning. So I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on for several years, the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, and I'm going to focus on the national network part more than the interpretation part. This is a program that's been funded by NSF, by the Climate Change Education Partnership, and our idea is that we can train enough people, interpreters I'll talk about in a moment, in research-based communication techniques so that we can really begin to shift the national discourse on climate change to be much less polarizing, much more productive, much more creative, and much more focused on solutions. And this is a partnership among folks like us in the informal education world, social scientists, as well as climate scientists, and some of the partners are represented there. So our idea is that interpreters at informal science institutions can really be seen as a key influential audience in the sense that they are more knowledgeable than the average person about the subject matter. They care more about this issue than the average person, and they are connected to more people by virtue of their work than the average person. So the idea is that by really building the capacity of these interpreters, building on what we know about climate change communication, the climate science itself, and kind of research on the audiences that visit informal science institutions, we can really create support for these folks so they can play that role essentially as paraprofessionals. They're not the doctors, as Richard Somerville was talking about. I guess they're more like physician's assistants. And so the idea is that many informal institutions exist, education institutions exist across the country. There are something like 1,500 informal science venues that you can identify, and they're visited by almost 2/3 of the population every year. And we've identified about 250 that are involved with oceans and as a focus. So that's kind of our focus, is the intersection of climate and oceans. And those are indicated by those dots on the map, and there are a variety of institutions from aquarium, zoos, as well as kind of national parks and marine sanctuaries and other organizations. And our goal is to reach about half of these directly. We've already reached about 80, and we're on target to reach about 150 over the next few years. And what I wanted to talk about is that in order to do this, in order to make a difference on this kind of scale, you need a network strategy. And a lot of what we do is about training, but I want to really talk about kind of the network building part of it. So what we do is when we do the training program, which we call study circles, that last about 100 hours over about a 6-month period, or in-person and online interactions, we bring groups, pairs from multiple institutions. Those are those work dyads listed there. And we have 10 institutions with 2 people each, a couple of climate science graduate students and facilitators that come together and form this community over this 6-month to 12-month kind of training period. And that's that community of practice on the left. And then what happens is those folks then go out and they train others in their own institutions. And they also themselves interact directly with visitors. And what is interesting is what the folks do is they not only interact with visitors, but they also talk to their colleagues, they talk to their family, they talk to their friends. And so you begin to create this kind of ripple effect of impact. And in fact, I won't talk about it in detail now, but we actually have evaluation data that shows the kind of spread of that kind of interpretive message as well as kind of the affect associated with it. And what I want to talk about a little bit is that this community of practice that happens during the learning process is a very supportive thing, and which is very important with dealing with an issue like this, which can be challenging in terms of the science content, but also challenging in terms of the kind of social and emotional kind of aspects of it. As people have talked about, this is can be a very polarizing issue. So you need to have a supportive community. And that just doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't just happen during the training. It needs to really continue. And what we're beginning to see is that community is beginning to take off, but it's not something that happens just on its own. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the needs of the alumni of this training program and how are we beginning to provide for them. When we started, we thought, this is great. We'll train people, they'll go implement stuff, we'll kind of be done, right? But it turns out that you need to keep thinking about the ongoing learning process. So, for example, one of the things we realized is that the people we trained at the beginning of our project actually were trained on information that now is outdated because we've done more social science research about communication. And the climate science has advanced. There's a new national climate assessment. There's a new, IPCC report. How do we make sure that people begin to not only go through training once, but have that opportunity to learn over time? Second, it's great to go learn stuff in a professional development course, and we do a lot of practice in our training program. But people, once they go home, they need support to implement things, and that need for support doesn't end at 6 months out. It's something that needs to be ongoing. Third, we realized that for our community to persist over time, we need to keep developing leadership within that community. We need some mechanisms to do that. And finally, we really see this whole effort as really a coalition building, kind of a movement building strategy, and you really need explicit strategies for that as well as just training. So what we've begun to do is realize we have to kind of build out what that program looks like, and I'm just going to describe briefly some of the mechanisms that we're beginning to use. And kind of how they map against each of those 4 goals. So one tool we have in our toolbox is we already have a group of about 15 to 20 alumni of the program who are folks who've agreed to be kind of leaders in their region for climate change education. And so they are prepared to go out and do workshops and things like that. And what we realized we could do is deploy them instead, or in addition, to provide support in their region for folks who've already been through the training program, to create kind of a local, regional support network and reach out to folks who have gone through the training program and talk to them about what are you doing, what's working, what's not working, what do you need, and be kind of a friendly ear for folks. And that is something that's just getting off the ground, but we think that could be a really important strategy across all of these goals. Second, we have a website that was initially developed with some funding from NOAA and supports this project as well as some others called climateinterpreter.org, and that's a place where we can really house a lot of the kind of training materials and resource materials so that as new communication research comes out, as new science information comes out, that is a place that people can go, alumni can go, and have kind of a trusted resource for those kind of materials. And as well, we think that it could also provide some kind of social networking. But interestingly, that has kind of emerged already on its own through a kind of a Facebook group that we didn't start, actually. It kind of started with some of the first study circles where people just started to connect with one another. And we realized that we could foster that a little bit. And so now the Facebook site has become the place when people find a new resource, whether it's a communication resource or a science resource, and they want to share it or want to get some other opinions about it. That's the place where they put it. And then people comment on it. So that seems like a good opportunity for kind of supporting that ongoing learning piece. But it hasn't really been the place where people talk about what they're doing. It's much easier to talk about somebody else's resource. So we're realizing that's probably not the most successful way to support the implementation piece. Then we have an electronic newsletter, which we realized is another opportunity, and it's one of the places where we can highlight what people are doing in the field and highlight some of those kind of success stories. It may kind of indirectly support people implementing back at home, but really it's kind of a way more to point people to resources. But we're realizing that that's a potentially really good resource, and using the constant contact technology, you have that ability to have the kind of analytics on what people are reading and what people are using. So that seems like that's another really good potential. Webinars is something that we've realized is actually probably one of the most important kind of ongoing training mechanisms we can provide, where it's an opportunity not only to transmit information, but also to give people an opportunity to discuss what they're learning. So as we've come up with new new social science research and recommendations for communication. That's been the way that we've been able to get that information out to folks who've maybe been trained a year or 2 years ago before that information was available. One of the questions we have with this is how can we scale it up? Is it something we can do on a regular enough basis? We were doing them once a quarter. Now we're trying to do them once a month. We'll see if we can kind of sustain that pace. One of the things we realized is that in order to do that, we're going to have more facilitators. So again, probably going back and drawing on some of those regional leaders is going to be really important, and that provides support for that ongoing kind of leadership development as well. And then finally, face-to-face meetings are something that people always really gravitate toward and really like. We have an opportunity at a bunch of different conferences to get people together, whether it's the National Zoo and Aquarium Conference or National Association of Interpretation, and others. And what we're realizing is we need to use that as more than a great social networking opportunity, but we really need to find some ways in a kind of a fun context to introduce some of the content that people can work with when they're gathering face-to-face. So we're starting to work on some I guess it would be like the equivalent of like fun icebreaker activities and party games, you know, in a way, that would actually allow us to have people practice with some of the content when we get together. And we tried this at the recent AZA meeting this fall, and we had people get together, and there was some social time and some updates from the project, and then we had people actually do a kind of communication strategic framing exercise in small groups for a short period of time to get a sense of it gave us actually a good sense of sort of taking the temperature of the group as to where people were at, and also gave people an opportunity to practice in kind of a fairly safe environment. So what we're realizing is that especially as the training is kind of ramping up and we're reaching more and more institutions, this set of strategies is going to become more and more critical and kind of occupy more and more of our time and our resources. Something we hadn't quite initially planned for, but we're kind of shifting in that direction. And then the final thing I wanted to kind of leave folks with is, so how do you actually evaluate whether any of this is working? People talk about community of practice all the time, and there is actually a really good set of indicators that come from Wenger and Traynor, who Wenger was along with Jean Lave, were two of the original authors of the kind of original community of practice literature. And so they talk about kind of 5 different dimensions that you could look at in terms of the value created by a community of practice. And our evaluation team is using this framework to kind of evaluate this dimension of the work. So the first part of it is really, what are the actual activities that happen? What are people talking about? And what's kind of the immediate value that people get, whether it's resources downloaded or whatever. The second is, how are you really building knowledge within that community? What's the kind of knowledge capital that you can create? And you can look at that as well in terms of the kind of knowledge that's represented by that communal work. Third is, are people taking this and actually applying it? That's sort of the implementation and change in practice piece. And then fourth, is it really improving the delivery of the kind of communication? Can you actually see that in performance improvement in the work that people are doing? And then finally, does the community actually take ownership of its own work and begin to define for itself what success looks like? So beyond just kind of implementing what they learned, where do they go next? And that's kind of the final stage. So we'll be looking at that over the next couple of years to kind of see how that plays out. And then finally, just for folks who are interested in learning more, we have an online electronic workshop that describes a lot of the basic interpretation approach, as well as resources on climate communication at those couple of websites. So, thanks.